All right, I'm just going to post in the, for those who are just joining us, good to see you this morning. We're going to, I'm just going to post in the chat box the source sheet for this morning's presentation. So let me just do that very quickly here, and then we'll introduce our speaker for this morning, and we'll get moving. Okay, here we go. Okay, hopefully you see that now in your in the chat box, that the source sheet has been posted, so you can access it and print it out to be able to follow along as you please. But I believe that Professor Amit will be also sharing it on the screen. So without further ado, let's get started this morning with our presentation. So one moment here, just also want to work out one other technical detail. Sorry. Slicha, a second. How you doing, Rabbi? Hey, my Michael. Okay, so here we go. Dr. Aaron Amit is a member of the Talmud department at Bar Ilan University in Ramat Gan, and has served as the department chair for 5 years. He is the author of a volume of critical commentary of the Talmud and of numerous scholarly articles dealing with the influence of contemporary Greco-Roman culture and language on rabbinic literature, the textual transmission of the Talmud Bavli, and the history of halacha. So without further ado, we welcome in Dr. Amit for this first part of the 3-part series on the coming Sundays. And so Dr. Amit, please take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, Rabbi Klinger. And it's a pleasure to be here on Sunday morning for you, Sunday evening for me. And I look forward to the next 3 Sundays to our studying together these sources on the Jewish family. What I'm going to be trying to do in these sessions is to give you a little window into what I do as a Talmud scholar with these sources. I'm not going to be talking about halacha l'maaseh. Halacha l'maaseh is a different area. You know, you can always consult your rabbis. I'm going to be talking about theory. I'm going to be learning the sources with you. And basically that's what I do in my classes in the Talmud department. And so what we've done is we've created these 3 sessions, which give you, we're going to, in the first session, we're going to talk about the Mitzvah of Procreation, Pru U'Revu U'Meluat Haaretz, Piriyah U'Reviyah. In the second session, we're going to talk about obedience. How much do children have to listen to their parents? And then in the third session, we'll be talking about taking care of elderly parents and the challenges that we find with that and the sources in the Talmud. So I'm going to try to keep the sessions to around 45 minutes. So we're starting now, it's about 5 after 5, 7 after 5. So we'll shoot for like 10 minutes to 11 your time. I'll be presenting the sources, we'll be discussing. If there's a question that you have and you like it's really important, something that's not clear, please feel free to stop me. I want you to be with me in the presentation. And then otherwise, if there are more questions that you want to go into more depth, we'll leave time for afterwards, and we have plenty of time for discussion after we go through the main sources. So what I'm going to do, in addition to the sources that have been shared in the chat, and I hope that everyone can hear me. If you want to just, you could give me a sign that it's all clear, you're getting good audio, okay. And I hope you have your coffee and you're relaxed, and let's open up the source sheet and take a look. So we're going to start our source with the Mishnah. And one of the things we do in the Talmud department is we're always using manuscripts. And what you see in front of you is what's considered to be the best Mishnah manuscript. It's a Mishnah Yivamot, chapter 6, Mishnah 6. And what I did is, here is the Mishnah picture of Ketav Yad Kaufman. And here is a transcription of the Mishnah in the printed editions. And then below is a translation. Now, sometimes, actually, the versions in the manuscripts are not as good as in the printed edition. This is a good example that the scribe forgot to put in critical information. We'll read the Mishnah and you'll understand what the scribe forgot, and then it was inserted in the margin. So the Mishnah says, Lo yibatel adam mipirya v'riviyah, ela im ken yesh lo banim. Beit Shammai omrim shnei zacharim, u'Beit Hillel zachar u'nekeva b'ra'am. So the Mishnah says that a man should not desist from procreation unless he has fulfilled the mitzvah of having children. Now, how much is that mitzvah? What is the minimum? Beit Shammai says 2 male children, and Beit Hillel says, and here in the Kaufman manuscript, it just has a quote of the verse, Zachar u'nekeva b'ra'am, from Genesis chapter 5, but it's missing the what do you have to have? So Beit Hillel says you need Zachar u'nekeva, you need a boy and a girl, and you see that the scribe added that on in the manuscript in the margin because it was forgotten, and the reason that he probably forgot is because you have Zachar and Nekeva coming one after the other in quick succession. So therefore, his eye skipped and he missed it. So usually the readings in the manuscripts are very good and it's very important, and we always have to look at the manuscripts. And this is a beautiful Spanish manuscript. But in this case, the scribe forgot to put in the opinion of Beit Hillel. So we have Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. Beit Hillel says you need 2 boys. Beit Shammai says you need 2 boys. Beit Hillel says you need a boy and a girl. And then we're going to go into I'm not going to go into this next source in too much depth. I'm giving you quick Talmudic background. And then what we're going to do is we're going to discuss more what the later authorities took from this topic. So what we're looking at now is the Tosefta. And a lot of times what I do when I learn sources is I compare the different manuscripts. So you can see that there is a table here. And on the right side, it is the Vienna manuscript. That's Ketav Yad Vina. Ketav Yad Erfurt, the Erfurt manuscript. Usually manuscripts are named for the libraries that they are housed in. And then there's a Geniza fragment, and then the first printed edition. Now, the Tosefta is the Tosefta that is in parallel to this first Mishnah that we've studied. And this first Mishnah, I would say, is pretty famous when you talk about the Mitzvah Procreation. People usually know the opinion of Beit Hillel. You have to have a boy and a girl. I can remember when we became parents. So the first child we had was a boy, the second was a girl. And immediately I said, okay, we've fulfilled Beit Hillel. So the Tosefta, what it does is I've divided it up into intro, then 3 laws, which we're not going to have time to go into, which basically deal with differences between the obligation of procreation for men and women. So there is an opinion that women are not obligated in Piriya or Ruvia. They're not obligated like a man is obligated and a woman is not obligated. But as we can see from here, if we go into more depth, and you're welcome to go into that afterwards, there are some differences, and some people think that the obligation is equal in this section. And then we have definition. Definition is what we just studied. How many children do you have to have? That's the part that I want to look into now. And then we have another section, which is called time limit. Okay, so how long do you have to fulfill the mitzvah of procreation? Now, all of these sources are translated below. Okay, so I translated everything. You have intro, you have 3 laws, definition, and the time limit. So don't be intimidated by the Hebrew. You're welcome to skip down and look at those translations, but I do want to put on the screen the definition and show you that in the Tosefta, which is another Tannaitic source, we have two opinions. Rabbi Natan Omer, Beit Shammai Omrim Shnei Banim, Kivanav Shel Moshe, Shene'emar Uvenei Moshe Gershom ve'Eliezer. In other words, here we have an addition, a proof. Beit Shammai brings a proof. 2 male children, just like the children of Moshe. Moshe had 2. He had his 2 sons were Gershom ve'Eliezer. So if that is the way that Moshe did the mitzvah, so that certainly is enough. Say Beit Shammai. Beit Hillel, Zachar u'Nekeva, Shene'emar Zachar u'Nekeva b'Ra'am. That's exactly what we just saw in the Mishnah, a boy and a girl. And again, they bring the verse from Genesis as if, in a sense, what we're trying to do is create a world when we have a family. And therefore, we're going back to that original creation of Adam v'Chava. Rabbi Yonatan or Rabbi Natan, and you can see that in the Vienna manuscript, it's Rabbi Yonatan. In Erfurt, it's Rabbi Natan. In the Geniza fragment, it's Yonatan. And it would make sense that it probably, the original reading would be Rabbi Yonatan, a different Tana, who brings another version of the disagreement between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. Rabbi Yonatan says, Beit Shammai omer Zachar v'Nekeva, uVeit Hillel omrim Zachar o Nekeva. Here we have a different idea. According to this version of the disagreement, Beit Shammai says you can have the minimum is a boy and a girl, and according to Beit Hillel, it is a boy or a girl. You don't need to have 2 children. 1 children is enough. And so that is what we see in the Tosefta. So when we finish with the Tannaitic sources, the next stage is to go into the Talmud itself. And I know that we're kind of moving along pretty quickly, but we want to get the whole picture before we look at the later sources. And the Talmud has a very interesting discussion, which we could spend a lot of time on. And again, what I'm doing here is I'm presenting the source in a way that graphically, it gives you an idea of the structure of the Talmudic discussion. And I always do this when I'm presenting Talmudic texts. So you can see that I use different fonts. I use a bold font when we're talking about Tannaitic material. That which is Tannaitic is in bold. And then I use a regular font for what is called Stama Talmud, or the editor's comments. And then a lot of times I will use a italic for a font of Amoraim. So let's take a look at the Sugiyah and see quickly. This will be easy for us because we just went over very similar material. So the Talmud starts with a discussion of the Mishnah that we saw above. Maita Mayu de Beit Shammai. What's the reasoning of Beit Shammai? Why do they say 2 boys? Yalfinan mi Moshe. They learn it from Moshe, as it is written, B'nai Moshe, Gershon, ve'Eliezer. So it seems that what the Talmud is saying, and they're basically getting this from an early source, as we saw in the Tosefta, that since Moshe, the lawgiver, had 2 boys, and that was enough for Moshe, so that therefore is the requisite amount of children that one has to have. Beit Hillel, on the other hand, Yalfinan mi briato shel olam. So, but on the other hand, Beit Hillel learns it from the creation of the world. And now the Sugya does what it likes to do in many places and asks, how come Beit Shammai doesn't learn from the creation of the world? Uveit Shammai lilfei mi briato shel olam. Why don't they learn it from the creation of the world? And we have the phrase, Ein danim efshar mi she'i efshar. We don't learn the possible from the impossible. So that is a phrase that appears numerous times in the Talmud in all kinds of different halachic discussions. But here what it means is we don't learn the possible, which is basically in the world the way it is today, there are many women, there are many men, and they can get married and have children. But in the time of the creation of the world, when God created man, there was only one man. And therefore, you can't learn from the creation of the world about the situation today. And therefore, that's why Beit Shammai doesn't learn from Brioto Shel Olam. That's why basically Beit Shammai learns from the creation of Am Yisrael as a people bound by law. Moshe, the lawgiver, is the one who is in the end who we follow. So they say, if that's the case, why doesn't Beit Hillel learn from Moshe? Beit Hillel nami lilfei mi Moshe. Let Beit Hillel learn from Moses. Amrei lach, no. You could say Moshe midatehu de'avad. No, Moses, he made that understanding on his own. It was a personal decision. It didn't have to do with legislating, and therefore Moshe need not be our example. We could go on in the discussion, but I want to show you just 2 more Tannaitic opinions that are brought in the discussion, and then I want to go on to really what I want to talk about most of the time. And we're going to look at what we saw, similar material in the Tosefta. There's a Braita, Tanya, Rabbi Natan Omer, Beit Shammai Omrim, Shnei Zacharim, V'shtei Nekevot, Uveit Hillel Omrim, Zachar v'Nekeva. So here we see another opinion of Rabbi Natan, who says that Beit Shammai actually thinks that you need to have 2 boys and 2 girls. Basically a doubling of what the original Beit Hillel opinion is. Beit Shammai says double that, 2 boys, 2 girls. And Beit Hillel says no, Zachar v'Nekeva. Okay, so it could be that this understanding would fit a model where Beit Shammai is more stringent. Usually Beit Shammai is stringent and Beit Hillel is more makil. So therefore, say in this source, Beit Shammai says double it. We have another source, Tanya Idach, right here, where we see a more lenient version. Rabbi Natan Omer, Beit Shammai Omrim, Zachar v'Nekeva, Uveit Hillel Omrim, O Zachar, O Nekeva. And Beit Hillel says either a boy or a girl. Now, what's interesting here is that in the Talmud, right after that, the reason is brought for the opinion of Beit Hillel. Amar Rava, Mai Tama de Rabbi Natan aliba de Beit Hillel. What's the reasoning of Rabbi Natan according to the opinion of Beit Hillel? Shneimar, he brings a verse from Isaiah. Lo tohu v'ra'ah leshevet yitzara. It wasn't for chaos the world was created, but it was created to be settled. The world was created for continuity. And this verse from Isaiah becomes very central in all the conversations about procreation. In other words, when we think about procreation, the verses that are brought are Zachar Nekeva B'Ra'am from Genesis, and this verse from Isaiah, Lo Tohu B'Ra'ah L'Shevet Yitzara, and then the source Gershon ve'Eliezer, which is actually from Chronicles. But I would say the two verses that are most brought in these discussions are these two verses, Lo Tohu B'Ra'ah and Zachar U'Nekeva B'Ra'am. So basically the idea from Isaiah is that it's enough that I have continuity. Once I've had a child, I have continued the continuity of the world. And therefore, by having one child, I have done my part, I have fulfilled the mitzvah of procreation. So basically, up until now, what we've seen is Tannaitic opinions about procreation. We've seen that they're all trying to describe conversations between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. And we've seen various opinions. I would say that the earliest opinion is that which we find in the Mishnah, which is Beit Shammai says 2 boys, and Beit Hillel says a boy and a girl. But then afterwards, we see that there are different opinions, and other Tanaim had different versions of the disagreement between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. This whole discussion that we've had until now is basically going to become what the rabbis, what the poskim, what the deciders of halakha call the Torah definition of procreation, the Doraita definition of how many children you have to have. Now, we're going to see that that the poskim distinguish between Doraita and Derabanan, between the Torah and the rabbis, because of a very curious sugya, a very curious Talmudic discussion, which appears not long after this one in Bavli Yevamot. And by the way, just so you know, soon we're going to be starting Bavli Yevamot in the Daf Yomi, those of you who are, but this is already on Daf Samech Bet. It's going to take us a while before we get here. But this, on Daf Samech Bet, Amud Bet, 62b, this is where we find this very strange sugya that really turns procreation upside down, and it really becomes the conversation piece for so much of what is happening, I would say, in contemporary Haredi society, in the way that Pru Revu is understood by the Jewish people. So let's take a look at this and try to understand what is strange about this sugya. Okay, so again, you have the source and you have my translation below. So if you want to follow along with that in the translation and look at it together with me on the screen, I'm going to read it in the original. So the sugya opens with Matnitin delav ki Rabbi Yoshua. The Mishnah is not like Rabbi Yoshua. In other words, everything we've learned, basically, which was the Mishnah, Beit Hillel, Beit Shammai, it doesn't accord with the opinion of Rabbi Yoshua. What does Rabbi Yoshua say? Rabbi Yoshua Omer, Nasa Adam Isha b'yalduto, Yisa Isha b'ziknuto. Hayulo vanim b'yalduto, Yulo vanim b'ziknuto. Rabbi Yoshua says, if a man married a woman when he was young, he must marry a woman when he is old. He should not remain unmarried he must marry again. If he had children when he was young, he must have children when he is old. Shene'emar, as it is stated, and this verse is from Kohelet, Baboker zarai zarecha v'la'erev al tanach yadecha ki eincha yodea eze yichshar hazeh ozeh v'im shnehem ke'echad tovim. He brings the verse from Kohelet, which is not, and I repeat, not a halachic verse, and he says that this is our motto. In the morning, you should have children. And he's taking this as baboker zarad zarecha, as when you're young, you should have children. V'la erev al tanach yadecha. And in the evening, you should not rest, because you never know which will be more appropriate, this one or that one, or perhaps both of them. Now, this looks to be almost like an agadic statement, not a halachic statement. And so it's already strange that the sugya connects the opinion of Rabbi Yoshua, which, by the way, appears in Avodah Rabbi Natan in a completely agadic context, and here it ties it into a halachic context and says that a person has to continue having children even into their old age, bringing the verse in Kohelet as proof for that. And this verse and this shita of Rabbi Yoshua becomes called by the poskim la'erev. Okay, so that's what I'm going to refer to it as, la'erev, which means in your older years, even as an elderly person, you need to continue having children. I like the interpretation of Rabbi Akiva better on this verse. He says, "Lamad Torah b'yalduto, yilmod Torah b'ziknuto, hayulo talmidim b'yalduto, yulo talmidim b'ziknuto." He takes the verse as having to do with the study of Torah, and again, that, I think, strengthens the idea that this verse is originally in a agadic context, not in a halachic context. And Rabbi Akiva says, just as you study Torah when you are young, you should study Torah when you're old. Just as you have students when you're young, you should have students when you're old. Now, everything, I think, would have been fine with this sugya, and it wouldn't have been connected so much to our topic if we wouldn't have had the conclusion. Amar Rabbi Matna halacha ke Rabbi Yoshua. We have a memra at the end of the sugya, which says that the halacha follows Rabbi Yoshua. So what's going on here? What is happening? We had the discussion in the Talmud about Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, the Mishnah before, and that you need a boy and a girl, or two boys, or maybe even two boys and two girls, a maximalist approach. But here, we have this strange opinion of Rabbi Yoshua, which is then followed by halacha ke Rabbi Yoshua, which seems to say that everything we've said before is dismissed, and a man has to procreate ad bli dai. In other words, keep having children, huge families. Basically, the sky's the limit. Just as in you're young, you have children, you continue having when you're old. And there's no number here that is mentioned, but it seems to be quite a bit of children. So this is basically what caused, I would say, a lot of problems with how to handle this source. And this basically ties in with so many things that have to do with Piriyah V'Riviyah. I maybe will send to you, if anyone is interested, I wrote an article about using the way that they used, they prevented having children in Talmudic times, and whether that was permissible or not and how it was done. That's an article that I've published, and you're welcome to read that. But basically, they did in the ancient world, there were ways that they knew how to refrain from having children, and that could have been used. And yet here we see that they are demanding, it seems, to have very big families. So what I want to do now, before we have our discussion, and I'm looking forward to hearing questions that you have, what you want to talk about, and we can go back and we can go more into depth. But I just want to present to you, as I promised Stephen that I would do, in around 45 minutes, the whole thing. And then we'll go back and we can have more discussion. And if we see that for next time, you'd rather kind of intersperse the discussion throughout, that's also fine. But so what I want to do now is show you how the poskim throughout the generations took this sugya. Before we do that, I just want to show you briefly the different versions in the Talmud. Okay, I just wanted to make sure that all of the Talmudic texts actually have this. And the answer is they all have it. In all of the texts, we have halakha Rabbi Yoshua in all of the different versions, as you can see. In Ktav Yad Ginsburg, 594, Matnitin Deloki Rabbi Yoshua Detanya, and then I skipped. The Mishnah does not follow Rabbi Yoshua as it's taught. Amar Rav Huna, halakha Rabbi Yoshua. So instead of it being Rabbi Matna, it's Rav Huna. But other than that, it's the same. And there's some other minor differences, but in all of them, it says halakha ki Rabbi Yoshua. So therefore, all of the poskim had to deal with this, all through the generations. So let's see what they did. Okay, so I have 10 sources here, which go through from the time of the Geonim, which is basically around the 700s up to around the year 1000. So I brought two sources from the Geonim who dealt with this problem. The first is the She'iltot, which is written by someone named Rav Achai Gaon, and the second is Halachot Gdolot. And basically, Halachot Gdolot has simply copied from the She'iltot. So it's really the same opinion. And so I wrote the summary. These two opinions say, Alma, Afal Gav De'itle Banim, Shari Le Lezivune Sefer Torah Uminasev Itata Bat Banim. So basically what this is saying is this. Even though a man has done the mitzvah of procreation and had the requisite amount of children, it is permissible for that man to sell his Sefer Torah, which is seen as being a very bad thing to do. You shouldn't sell your Sefer Torah. If you have a Sefer Torah, basically it's a mitzvah of all to have a Sefer Torah. So you shouldn't sell it, but you are allowed to sell it in order to marry a woman who can have children and create another family. So basically, these two opinions seem to be taking quite seriously the mitzvah or the opinion of Rabbi Yoshua. But they don't say it explicitly, and they don't say exactly how many children you have to have. So let's go on to the next opinion, which is the opinion of the Rif, Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi. Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi, the Spanish decider of halakha, he rules that he's basically the one who comes up with the distinction between the Rabbanan and Doraita. The Rif says, Vaha milta, he brings it, what it says, Amar Rav Matna halacha Rabbi Yoshua, and then he says, Ha milta de Rabbanan. That is the rabbinic position. That is the rabbinic mitzvah, according to Rabbi Yoshua. Aval deoraita, but from the Torah, kivan sheyesh lo zachar v'nekiva, kiem mitzvah piriya v'rivia. So this is really very important. This source here is basically becomes accepted by all, that there's a distinction between the rabbinic mitzvah and the Torah mitzvah. So according to the Torah, we have to have a boy and a girl. According to the rabbis, we have to add to that. According to the rabbis, even when we're old, even when a man is old, he has to continue having children. Now, you can ask, what does that mean? Obviously, that's the question. Okay, so what does that mean? Does that mean that a person actually has to take this seriously? Because usually when we have a rabbinic mitzvah, we take it very seriously. And we want to fulfill the rabbinic mitzvah just as much as the Torah mitzvah. So I want to skip over for a second the Nimukei Yosef, who's a commentary on the Rif, and I want to go to source number 5, Rabbi Zrachia Halevi. Rabbi Zrachia Halevi, who is a posek from Provence, from the south of France, he is the most stringent, and he takes this very literally, and he is insistent that this is halacha l'maaseh, and just as a man has the mitzvah of having children when they're young, they have the mitzvah of having children when they're old. And I want to look at this pretty carefully, and you can see that I translated his main points into English, but I just want to read it inside for you to understand that he takes this seriously, and therefore I would say this mitzvah cannot be dismissed so quickly or so easily. So he said, first of all, he brings the Rif, and then I'm going to start here with Nir E. Nir E midivrei Rav Zal, and he's talking about the Rif, Rav Yitzchak Alfasi. It seems that according to the Rav, Ita lematnitin ve'ita leRabbi Nachman, that there's two things. One is that the Mishnah of Beit Hillel is accepted. The other is that Rav Nachman is accepted. Rav Nachman said that a man must be married. A man should never be without a wife. V'leshinuya d'shaninan b'gemara aliba didei ein lo banim nosei isha bat banim yesh lo banim nosei isha delav bat banim. According to Rav Nachman, it would be permissible to marry a woman if you have fulfilled the mitzvah of procreation. You could marry a woman who cannot have children. But he disagrees with this, and he says, "Va'anu lo kach nir elan." I don't agree with this. Deha behedya, because it says explicitly, begemara, matnitin delav ke Rabbi Yoshua. The Mishnah does not according to Rabbi Yoshua. V'kevan de'ifsaka hilchata ke Rabbi Yoshua, and since the halacha was decided according to Rabbi Yoshua, mimele idchala matnitin delo yivatel. The Mishnah is dismissed. The Mishnah has been pushed aside because the halacha follows Rabbi Yoshua. V'leita lematnitin mikame braita, and therefore the Mishnah is canceled out. Ella afilu yesh la banim lo yivatel mi piriya v'riviyah. And even if a man has many children, he cannot desist from having more children. And ideally, eino nosei isha delav bat banim, and therefore he should not marry a woman who cannot have children. Af al pi sheyesh lo kama banim, even though he has already children. Umocher sefer Torah lisa isha bat banim. Ve'af al gav di midirabanan hi, and he says, even though this is a rabbinic understanding, as the Rif said, ein hefresh bakach bein doraita l'Rabbanan. There's no difference here between the mitzvah of, according to the rabbis and according to the Torah. There's no nafka mina. You still need to keep having children. And then Rav Zrachi Halevi offers two possible nafka minas. Here, I'll just read it in the English so you can see. The Rif argued that there's a distinction between the Torah commandment and the Rabbinic command of procreation, but he did not explain what that difference actually means. According to the Baal Ma'or, Rabbi Zrachi Halevi, the mitzvah of procreation is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yoshua. And even if a man reaches old age, he should marry a woman who can still have children. And he should even sell a Sefer Torah in order to be able to marry that woman. Accordingly, the difference between the Rabbinic commandment and the Torah commandment, he limits to two cases. One, a case where a man was married for 10 years to a second wife and has already fulfilled the Torah commandment. That man is not required to divorce his second wife. And two, a case where a man's wife dies and he has not fulfilled the Torah commandment. He does not have to wait the requisite shlosha regalim in order to marry again, in order to fulfill the commandment of procreation. In other words, Rav Zrachi Halevi takes this very seriously. This is a mitzvah that has to be fulfilled. Now, I think we can all start to imagine in our minds the kind of problems that this can present to the family structure. And I think the Ramban, Rav Moshe ben Nachman, was very aware of this, and therefore he has a totally different understanding than Rav Zrachi Halevi. And the Ramban tries to kind of say to everyone, let's calm down here. Let's think logically. And so, as he does in many places, the Ramban just uses beautiful language and basically a deep understanding of rabbinic sources to say what he thinks this really means. And he says, Kevan de mitzvah de rabbananhi, keminhag derech eretz. In other words, he's already saying that this is kind of like a mitzvah of the way of the world. Midekana sivla talmuda beboker zarait zarecha velo izkiru beze isur. The Talmud didn't say, it didn't use the language of prohibition, right? It used the language of Kohelet. And it used the language of Isa Isha, mitzvah lechatchila. And then he uses the important language, ein kofin, velo korin avaryana lamisha eino rotze la'asok ba. And he says, this is only lechatchila, and you certainly do not call someone who doesn't do it a transgressor. Everything is fine here. A man should not desist from Piriyavriya. Asur hula, but the main thing according to the Ramban is asur lo la'amod belo isha. He shouldn't be without a wife. Vakatuv omer lo tov heyot adam levado v'hainu de Shmuel v'ihu v'Rav Matna mar amar chada umar amar chada v'la pligi. Look what he does here. He basically says, there's no machloket. Rav Matna didn't come to say literally halacha Rabbi Yoshua, as Rav Zrachi Halevi had argued. He's not saying you really have to have so many children. He's saying you do your best, you have a family. The main thing, the most important thing is that you have a partner, that there shouldn't be this loneliness. And therefore, a man should always have a wife. If you ask in the opposite direction, should a wife always have a husband? That's an interesting question, and the rabbis are split on that. Some say that there's this idea that women can do better without a husband than a man can do without a wife. But there are others who say, no, the wife also must have a husband. If you want to look back in the Tosefta, you'll see those discussions that I didn't go into. It was part 2 of this Tosefta that we looked at above. So basically now what we've seen is 2 very different attitudes. Rav Zrachi Halevi, who takes it very seriously, and I would say if we use the Haredi family as the kind of model of Le'erev, the idea that you have to continue having children. So you could say that Rav Zrachi Halevi is a more Haredi approach. And then the Ramban's approach, which he doesn't say that you shouldn't have as many children as you can, but he certainly puts the emphasis on partnership. He doesn't think that in your old age you have to continue having children if you've already fulfilled the mitzvah of procreation. I want to look at also, I'm going to skip over for now the Rambam. The Rambam also seems to kind of be here in the middle. He tries to say, Kol zman sheyesh bo koach, as much as you have the strength to do it, which seems to kind of demote it to a kind of lichatchila, you should try, but if it doesn't work out, it's okay. And he also gives a little bit of a motivational idea. Shekola mosif nefesh echad miYisrael ki'ilu bana olam. Anyone who had just one person into the world has built a whole world. What I wanted to look at in conclusion were 2 very brief things. One, the Shulchan Aruch, and then I wanted to finish with a really nice article of Rav David Stav, who basically goes through all the sources, and I'm going to bring what he brings as his recommendation at the end. So in the Shulchan Aruch, Rav Yosef Karo basically brings different ideas that we've seen already. And it's not very clear what his real opinion is. He says, Im yesh lo banim lo yimkor ela yisa isha she'ina bat banim, which seems to be that he's leaning in the direction of more towards the Ramban and saying that more important, you should have a partner, you should be married. But then he brings the Yesh Omrim, and he says, Yesh Omrim, she'afilu im yesh lo banim, yimkor sefer Torah kadei she'isa isha bat banim. So that Yesh Omrim is a more machmir approach, more in line with Rav Zrachi Halevi and with the Geonim that we saw in the beginning. Let's look at Rav Moshe Isserlis. Rav Moshe Isserlis, the Ramah, he says on that same Shulchan Aruch, he has a note, Haggah, and he has what I see is a very important comment. He says, V'chein, im yesh lo banim harbe umityareh she'im yisa isha bat banim yavo ktatot umerivot bein habanim uvein ishto mutar lisa isha she'ina bat banim. So the Ramah says, if he's already had a lot of children, and he's scared that by having more children, it's just going to cause arguments and tension, so better that he marries a woman who is not bat banim, better that he marries a woman who cannot have more children, better that he stops and does not continue the mitzvah of procreation. There was a similar idea that was brought in the Nimukei Yosef above that we skipped over. And then I just want to finish now with Rabbi David Stav. He has an article called Principles of Family Planning. It's in a choveret that's called Sohar. He's the head of the Rabbinic organization in Israel called Sohar. And he basically, I think in a similar way to the Ramban, he is very much in favor of taking into consideration all kinds of different issues in family planning, including how much money a family has, how much effort they're willing to put into education, and let's just read through his conclusion, and then we'll open up for discussion. He says, Chachamim lamdu midivrei Kohelet ule'erev al Tanach yadecha. So the rabbis learned from the words of Kohelet ule'erev, you shouldn't stop. Sheyesh lo sif ulolid yeladim gam lachar kiyum achiyuv abesisi shal mitzvat pirya v'reviyah. The rabbis learned that even after the basic mitzvah, a person should continue. B'dvarenu la'el, as we said above, her'enu kama siyagim l'chiyuv zeh. Above, we saw a number of boundaries to that, which were the following. Aleph, Ladat Rabim min harishonim v'aposkim ein medubar b'chiyuv gamur ele be'etzah tova u'b'minhag derech eretz. We saw that there are a certain number of the Rishonim and deciders of halacha who say that this is not a halacha gemura, it's eitzah tova, it's good advice, and minhag derech eretz. That's certainly what we saw in the Ramban. Number two, yitachen shemi sheyesh lo shnei banim v'shnei banot patur legamrei midin zeh. It would seem that someone who has two boys and two girls does not apply to them ula erev, and that is learned from that second opinion of Beit Shammai, that maximalist one that we saw in the Gemara above. Point number three, Ledat Rabim min haposkim hachiyuv hu rak shelo limana legamrei milavi yeladim nosafim leolam ach mutar l'raveach et ha'leidot ketov beinei ha'orim. So basically, this is called spacing out. In other words, certainly parents are allowed to space out and to plan that they want to slow down the number of children they have, and that's perfectly legitimate, and that they can do ketov beinei ha'orim. And this is important to Rav Stav, and really important for I think what we would say would be a healthy family. Point number four, mitzvah zo yuchola lidachot mipnei shikulim rabim. Having more children can be pushed aside for many different issues, lefi rova poskim, and these include sar leida, the pain of childbirth, sar gidul banim, the difficulty of bringing up children, shlom bayit, peace in the home, ksheim kalkaliyim, so financial difficulties, va'af shikulei chinuch, and even if you don't think you're going to have enough time to put into the chinuch of the children. Ach, besofo shel davar, mi sheolid adam yeladim v'yeladot, v'hu savur, v'lefachot ben uvat, v'hu savur, she'im yosif leolid yivatzru bekach ksheim kalkaliyim, zugiyim o chinuchiyim, harei she'meikar adin einu chayav levi yeladim nosafim leolam. And he ends by saying, basically going back to the Torah definition, if you've had a son and a daughter and you feel that you can't do any more, and you can't have more children, that is definitely enough. So I think tiny bit I went over, but I tried to stick to around 45 minutes. And now questions. Carol.
I have a lot of questions, but my first one is on the last thing, which is his statement in Dalet, the mitzvah, is conditioned or whatever, can be modified because of these things. Does that apply to just this discussion of continuing later, or does it apply also, can you basically just have one child? In his view, I'm not asking you for psak, but you know what I mean, when he's saying that.
I mean, I think according to Rav Stav, if someone had one child, that would be, they've done the commandment. In other words, in Daled, when he says mitzvah zo, he's talking about the mitzvah of what he calls la'erev. In other words, the mitzvah, the rabbinic mitzvah. So he's not talking about just one child, he's talking about the mitzvah of continuously adding. He's saying that mitzvah can be pushed aside for many different shikulim. Lefi rova poskim, right? Not Rav Zrachi HaLevi. Rav Zrachi HaLevi wouldn't agree with Dalet, but we don't have to agree with Rav Zrachi HaLevi either. He's a very maximalist and machmir approach.
Right, so he's not referring to the basic, he's not making a statement at all here about the basic mitzvah.
No.
Right, that's what I thought, but I wanted to clarify.
Yeah, mitzvah zo is the rabbinic, Rabbi Yoshua, yeah.
Right, but also I wanted to I had a whole bunch of other questions, but
okay, sure.
in 62b, I mean, it doesn't seem to me that necessarily the concern is really pru or vu in general. It's this whole issue of like a second wife,
Right.
You know what I mean? In that context, you could sell a Torah, not because it's incumbent upon, you know what I mean? Like, I even wondered, at first I wondered where Rabbeinu Gershom played in here, but I guess they're talking about if you're a widower. Do you know what I mean? Like,
so if you're talking about the decree of Rabbeinu Gershom, Me'or HaGolah, and not forbidding polygamy, that's what you mean. So Rabbeinu Gershom said that a man is not allowed to marry more than one wife. But you have to remember that wasn't accepted at all in Islamic countries, and that was not the position in the Gemara times. A man could marry numerous wives. So it's not clear that this is talking about if the wife has died.
Right, that's what I was.
Right. Yeah, but certainly among the poskim, that kind of becomes the assumption that we're talking, that the Rabbi Yoshua is talking about when a person's wife has died and he's going to remarry. He should remarry a woman who can have children. Yeah. Okay.
Also, I'm sorry, another kind of small point. I think at one point you said when we were doing the Mishnahs that you thought the original was probably Yonatan, not Natan, but then the Gemara says Natan. So they
Right. So in the Gemara, we have two braitot in the name of Rabbi Natan, right? Tanya Rabbi Natan Omer, and we have, again, Tanya Idach, a different version of Rabbi Natan. But in the Tosefta, we have Rabbi Natan and Rabbi Yonatan, and I think that's the original because I think that we find in certain places, these are late Tanaim, Rabbi Natan and Rabbi Yonatan, and the similarity of their names got it confused, and people thought, it says Rabbi Natan twice, but no, it's actually two different Tanaim, and I just think that makes up more sense. Two different Tanaim with two different versions of the disagreement between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. So basically, this is getting into very technical things of Talmud scholars, but a lot of times the Vienna manuscript is the better Tosefta manuscript, and the Erfurt manuscript, the one here, is more in line with the Bavli. So you can see that the Erfurt manuscript has Rabbi Natan on that second one. And on the first one, it doesn't have anything, but so for what that's worth, that's what I meant when I said that I think Rabbi Yonatan is the original.
Great, thank you.
More questions or things that you want to know more about that I could think about for, first of all, that I could add, I could obviously send you more sources. I mentioned the article that I can send you. I could put that in the chat, but first I want to know about if there's more questions.
Okay, if there are, I guess, no more questions for Dr. Amit, I guess what we'll do now is we'll take a break for 6 days and 23 hours, and then we'll resume next week at the same time with a continuation of this series. So a big thank you to Dr.
Okay, I wanted to ask one question before that. As I went through the sources, was I going, because I don't know you, so it's hard. When I usually know my students, I know how fast I can go. And so was it going too